Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Mortgage Quality and Compliance webinar. This is Susan Milazzo. I run the California MBA, and we are very happy that you can join us today. We hold these webinars every month on the fourth Thursday, different compliance topics. So if you have joined us today because the registration information was forwarded to you by someone else, I'm happy to have you email me your email address so that I can put you on our list and you can be receiving these directly in the future. Just a couple of housekeeping rules you can see on the slide currently up. If you have a question for our speakers, you can pose those in the questions dialog box in the lower right-hand corner of the menu on the right, and we'll pose those and address those at the conclusion of the presentation. So we're going to go ahead and get started today by thanking our 2019 Mortgage Quality and Compliance sponsor, the Compliance Group, and I will turn it over to Jeff Lurie.
Thank you, Susan. So we at the Compliance Group, we're very happy to support the California MBA, specifically the Mortgage Quality and Compliance Committee, and obviously its work to educate the lending community, excuse me, on a wide variety of risk management topics. In my travels the last several months, I've been seeing an increasing inquiries from clients and prospects around deeper dive reviews. Resources are a bit tighter. Firms are looking for ways to efficiently and thoroughly meet their SAR obligations. Now, the challenge many of firms have and what they're facing is that the volume of activity, isn't large enough to warrant a full-time resource to the investigative task. And that's where the Compliance Group can help. With our certified fraud examiners, we can help conduct thorough file reviews, present those findings in an easy-to-digest format to help you determine if a SAR filing is required. Now, this is my own personal opinion, with the potential for lower volumes in the second half of the year, a resurgence in non-QM lending, I suspect we're going to see an uptick in SAR-eligible activity. So I'd recommend that you do a quick review of your SAR processes, and if you think you may need some help in the file review area with CFE-level talent, give us a call. And Susan, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Jeff, and thank you for the support from the Compliance Group. We'll get right into our agenda today and want to let everybody know that in addition to our major conferences happening over the summer, we do have 3 free networking events that are coming up, and I encourage you to join us if you are available in these in these locations. On June 13th, we're going to be in San Diego at an event that's sponsored by Plaza and the Young Mortgage Professionals Association. On June 18th, we'll be in San Francisco at an event sponsored by Severson and Worsen. And on July 11th, we will be in Folsom, California at an event sponsored by Sierra Pacific. So lots of ways to be joining us for those free networking events over the next few weeks. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Monica McCarthy with Crosscheck Compliance, who is our committee chair, and she can give us some opening remarks and introduce our presentation today. Monica?
Great. Thanks so much, Susan, and appreciate everyone joining us in our committee today for what is going to be a very interesting presentation on some cutting-edge issues I know many of you are dealing with, and you'll hopefully learn some interesting things. So today we have 2 terrific speakers. I'm going to introduce them. First is Raymond Snytsheuvel. Raymond is a mortgage industry attorney, and he has over 25 years of experience as an in-house general counsel and compliance officer at national mortgage companies. He is currently a partner at the Garris law firm, and he is located in Orange County, California. He's a graduate of Cal State University Long Beach with a degree in finance and specialty in real estate, and received his law degree from Western State University College of Law. He brings to his practice his experience as a loan officer and hands-on experience in processing, underwriting, funding, customer service, internal audit, thus providing legal representation that is informed by practical experience at all levels of a mortgage company. He prides himself on providing common sense, business-minded solutions to legal and operational challenges. Raymond advises clients also on corporate and general counsel functions, consumer finance, regulatory, federal and state laws, risk management, and risk assessments. He's got a depth of knowledge in all of the applicable federal and state laws that I will not go through and reiterate. And Raymond also helps clients navigate through various investor, warehouse bank, and state exams, in addition to corporate transactional law issues, such as contract management, negotiation, general corporate governance, and overseeing litigation matters, as well as counseling on government and industry relations, bringing experience from his in-house and leadership roles in industry trade associations. Next, our second speaker is Atul Varshneya. He works at Tavant as a vice president and heads the company's artificial intelligence and machine learning practice. Atul is an experienced technology exec. He has hands-on knowledge in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and software technologies, and applying them to business problems. Before joining Tavant, he was Vice President of Technology, leading the Artificial Intelligence Research and Development Lab at Samsung SDS Research America. There, he developed technology for AI-based decision-making for enterprise solutions. It involved cutting-edge research in the areas of reinforcement learning and deep learning, and involved working closely with academia, including professors at UC Berkeley, University of Alberta, who are known authorities in these fields. Atul has held leadership positions at many other companies, including Agility, Bay Packets, and Motorola, and he has a Ph.D. from the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. So welcome to both Raymond and Atul, and let me turn it over to you for today's presentation.
Okay, well, this is Ray Snytsheuvel. Thank you for the introduction. I'm always amazed at how much I've done, I guess, and really, honestly, most of it's true. So with that, and I thank you so much for the California Mortgage Bankers Association for giving me the opportunity to speak here. As most people know, I think there's some people who might know me on this call. I generally don't like to talk much or talk about me, so with that, I will get into. I know, it's not true. I will get into the presentation. By the way, do I have controls? Someone can tell me?
You do.
Very cool. Okay, then I need to find the advance. Bear with me for a minute. Technology issues. There we go. Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone being on the call, and what I'm trying to do with my perspective and how I want to approach this call from a fair lending is more of a dialogue. You know, I'm not giving answers here. I mean, I'll give some, I suppose, if it helps. But really, it's more about approaching what we're going to do and how we have to approach fair lending, kind of in the modern environment where we have a lot of technology. So this is not a fair lending treatise type of training. And as you can see here, I'm kind of actually focusing on just a couple of things. So, for example, bear with me here. Okay. Oops. So, for example, I just want to cover kind of a primer on fair lending for those who otherwise might need a little bit of that, and kind of addressed it in two ways. So we know fair lending. If we talk about fair lending, it's a major concept, and it kind of integrates into everything. If you've done compliance and you've managed compliance, you know that it's on your chart or on your list. It's not just one thing. It permeates different things. It could be pricing, underwriting, marketing, other areas. It could be a treatment of monitoring phone calls and how people will respond, how your staff responds to borrowers. It kind of permeates everywhere. And of course, it's pretty much a strong gauge of your general compliance. So it's often looked at the state and federal level. So it is something that you really want to invest time in, at least to understand, how you're performing in your fair lending. There's really, from fair lending as a practical matter, and as we talk about more technology here, and artificial intelligence and machine learning, there's a couple of issues I want to hit. Typically, fair lending is three things. We have the overt discrimination, and that says, we don't lend to people like you. That should never happen. That should never be said. That shouldn't be uttered if it ever is. We all know we should, anyway, take immediate action. The more subtlety issues are where you're going to find disparate treatment and disparate impact. And I think when we start talking about technology, that's kind of where we're going to see some of our challenges. So just to real quick, as I see it and as I define it, Disparate treatment is responding differently to a group of people versus another group because of some kind of characteristics. And sometimes it's not necessarily ultimately intentional. The example I often use is again, this may or may not be true how it works, but the example I would use is maybe how production would respond to particular borrowers. If you have a borrower who knows what they're doing, they've done refinancing before, you talk about the Boston Red Sox, assuming you like the Boston Red Sox, and so do they. You have a great conversation, and they're easy to get to. When they call, you pick up the phone right away. When you get another borrower that you get the phone call, but well, actually they're foreign. They have more questions. This is the first time a mortgage for them, and they actually have an accent as well, which is kind of hard to work with. You know what? I'm not going to pick up the phone as quickly. I'm going to go take my break first and then call them back. Is that disparate treatment? Maybe. Is that right? Maybe. I'm not here to judge. I'm giving the examples of where things can happen. And so disparate treatment might be somewhere there. It's just where you're not really thinking about it, but somehow you're making an adjustment that maybe you shouldn't be making. Disparate impact is a little bit different. And disparate impact, as we know, from HUD and others in highest levels, that it still exists, and it's even unintentional. Disparate impact is setting up a policy that is benign, but has a notable adverse effect on a certain group. By that I mean, I'll give you an example. I learned this in law school, and for the lawyers there, you probably all had to go through constitutional law and learn this too. And there was a law many, many years ago that was a matter of they wanted to get, I believe it was like the homeless people off the street, and they also knew they slept under bridges. And they said, you know what, we want homeless people off the street. They made a law that said you can't do that. That's a protected group. You can't do that. They said, good. Then they passed a law that says you can't sleep under a bridge. Well, that's kind of benign. It doesn't say anything about characteristics. You can't sleep under a bridge. But they said, well, you can't do that either because that has an adverse impact on somebody. So they recognize that it kind of like a proxy, if you will, it will have an impact on a certain group. It doesn't have to be intentional. It can be completely accidental. But that's what disparate impact is about. And again, I think that's also where we look at technology, we look at policies. That's where we have to, in risk management arena, have to sift through it and find out if in fact what we're doing might have some kind of an impact, even unintended, and even though the policy doesn't speak to it, will have some kind of effect. So disparate treatment, disparate impact is kind of where I think we have to think about when we start talking about the technologies that we deploy and what's the intelligence behind them. Okay. So next, let me see if I can do this. Bear with me. So I'm making sure my clicker's working. Very good. So what does that say? How does it look? What do we look for fair lending these days, and more of the environment of fair lending? So first thing I would say is there's an expectation, and again, we can look at the law, we can argue it or not, but the point is by regulators, by others, there are consumer groups at a minimum, and I think a lot of lenders would agree, there should be an attempt to invite everyone to apply for credit. I mean, I can put it into the negative. There certainly shouldn't be some kind of a policy or an attempt to disinvite or discourage people from applying. We know we can't do that. But there should be an attempt to invite everyone to apply for credit. And so you see that mostly like in the marketing scheme. You want to make sure that what you're doing is you're opening up and not somehow leaving somebody out unintentionally or intentionally, which would be wrong. The other thing about fair lending is kind of making assumptions about someone's characteristics based on the group, based on the group that they're part of. So it's easy to, and again, maybe when we talk about technology, it might have the challenge, but it's easy to say, well, listen, if you're this kind of group and this is the characteristic and that's what they do, then this person must do it as well. Well, there's no real nexus to that. We don't know what each individual will actually do. So as I put here, you don't know me, okay? That's really kind of one of the threshold issues in fair lending as well, is to make assumptions about somebody when you don't really know them. You just know that some characteristics about them and make some kind of conclusions that maybe you shouldn't be making. So again, fair lending environment, the expectation is you must be thoughtful about them and be aware of that. Impact will generally manifest in invitation to apply credit or pricing policies. We kind of know this, right? So when you see an issue, it's going to be, hey, did we invite enough people? And you can look at those numbers. We'll talk about that later. So did we invite enough people to apply for a loan? Or are we somehow not doing our job in doing that? Secondly, when we look at a loan, are we doing a fair, balanced approach of approving and denying the right people for the right reasons? Again, intentionally, unintentionally, we don't know. Or ultimately, pricing. Are you maybe pricing higher for minorities than not? That could be an issue. But that's where you see fair lending will manifest itself. The causes might be somewhere else, but that's where it manifests. So that's what you have to look for. And then finally, and we'll go in great detail on other things shortly, but be careful of what gets introduced into business decisions. And we've talked about this. This is where you have to be aware, you have to be involved, you have to scrutinize the filters people are using for marketing or for underwriting. You want to be part of that process to understand, is there a disparate treatment or disparate impact issue? There's an expectation for that. And when we're talking about artificial intelligence that can aggregate data and draw what appears to be logical conclusions, you question if it's permissible. In other words, by the way, in compliance, my guess is people ask you this a lot. If you're in compliance and you have marketing or sales call you and said, hey, I have a great idea, and this is how we're going to do business. Now we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and you're smiling until that's a brilliant idea. It actually makes great business sense. It's illegal, it violates Section 8, but it's actually a good idea. So we can't do it because of the violation. It doesn't mean the idea in premise was right or wrong. So same thing here. If you talk about artificial intelligence, it might be making some conclusions with information it has, and we don't know whether it has the right sensitivities to address the things that we in risk management want to consider. So I think those are the kind of things that in a fair lending environment, those are the expectations that are put upon us and that we need to address. Next, I would like to talk about risk management basics. We talk about fair lending basics, and now we'll talk about risk management basics. What do we do? So people in risk management. And so why does this matter? And again, we'll talk about the details. We'll talk about Facebook. We'll talk about technology and working its way in shortly. But I want to establish what we're trying to achieve. And what I like to do is to achieve my 45-second speech. And those who know me well, I've done this all the time to the point that people roll their eyes, but I think it works. And the real question is, can I speak to my regulators, my investors, and explain why, in a particular risk point, I have everything covered? I know what I'm doing, we've checked it out, et cetera. Have I done that? In 45 seconds, I have to be able to explain that to somebody, and then they nod their head and they say, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's the goal, okay, when you're dealing with risk, when you're dealing with risk points, and fair lending is no different. So what you really have to do is in risk management is the general nature of our processes. Do you understand the general nature of your processes and your technologies? Technologies you have in place. Are you using Mavens? Are you using this? Are you using automated underwriting? How much are you using FICO? Those are the kind of things you at least want to be able to speak to, that I know what we have. You also want to be able to speak how compliance played a role in determining whether technology or these processes were sufficient. And I'm talking particularly like fair lending kind of filters in this case, but what steps have you taken to actually support the process? What controls are in place to ensure the results are right and will always be right? And I think this is an important one. And I think people who are not in risk management maybe don't appreciate this as much as a lot of people who are in risk management. It's one thing to get something right on a given day. Everything was right. And so therefore, the presumption is, therefore, everything will continue to be correct. Well, that's not entirely true. Not if you don't have internal controls that ensure that you'll get it right, and you will always get it right because there's a process in place. For example, if you're going to do marketing is going to come to me, and everything that I have, I sign off on it. I have a control. Nothing gets past me. Okay, so we have some kind of controls. That's what with regulators and others, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for the control, not whether you got it right, but whether you're always going to get it right. That's really the test. And then ultimately, we have to speak as to why we're confident with our conclusions. We looked at it. We determined that, as a matter of fact, there's no disparate impact, or it's not going to have a pricing impact, or something to that effect. The reason I bring that up is, as we go through how we're going to address fair lending in an AI and a machine learning environment, we don't lose these. In fact, we probably have to use it more and just apply these kind of concepts. Again, these are mine. You might have different ones. You might have ones that have more bullet points, less bullet points, but this is what I use. So at a minimum, we should be kind of filtering what the issues are and having, as I say, your 45-second speech about every risk point that you possibly have and why you think it's okay. So with that, let me see. Next, we have Atul here on the line. So perhaps you can now really give us some basics and then detail about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and what I always find is interesting, the difference between the two. So hopefully you have control of the computer as well.
Let me see.
He should.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to talk about this topic because it's in my personal interest. It's a very interesting area to talk about. What I'm going to do is, as Raymond mentioned, I'm going to talk more from technology perspective. And what I will attempt to do is to show how important it is and what can be the potential magnitude of this issue when we're talking about using AI in any industry, and specifically in the area of fair lending. And I'll also subsequently talk about how bias can creep into the solutions that are built using artificial intelligence. So to get started, let me see if I have the controls of how to move this forward. There you go. So the point I want to make, as I said, about the magnitude is that AI is just about everywhere. And in all industries, in various solutions that those industries are using, it's so widespread that we unknowingly are using AI, the solutions built by AI, so many times during the day that we don't even realize that we are almost dependent on the solutions that have been built using AI. Here are a couple of quotes to just drive that point home. Andrew Ng, who's a very well-known personality in the area of artificial intelligence, in his very well-received talk about AI is the new electricity, he says it's very hard to think of an industry that will not be transformed by AI in the next several years. And that is indeed, that's what we are seeing these days. The other quote is from the director of AI at Tesla, Andrej Karpathy. He, in fact, goes to the extent of saying that even the code that is being written for making decisions is going to be not written by humans, but will be actually done through machine learning. He's basically saying his neural networks represent the beginning of fundamental shift in how we will write the software, and he calls it Software 2.0. And in a lighthearted manner, he also tweeted that gradient descent, which is basically the algorithm which is used for machine learning, says that can write better code than you. So that's indeed so true. And in fact, during the subsequent slides that I'll be using, this point will keep coming back again and again. So just to also show you how prevalent or how widespread use of AI is today, these are some trends that I have seen, from various sources. The number of startups that are there, compared to the startups in general, which has increased by 28% in this period, 2015 to 2018, the number of AI startups have increased by 113%. Similarly, the funding for general startups, in general has been about 100%, while for AI startups has been 350%. The adoption in general is also quite significant across all industries. The performance of AI, in terms of speed, in terms of accuracy, both have dramatically increased over the last few years. You can call it the effect or maybe the cause of its adoption. Because it's getting adopted, therefore there's a lot of investment in making it better, and therefore it gets adopted more. It's a virtuous cycle. So as you can see, the speed, even over a year, for training the ImageNet problem in machine learning has improved 16x times. The accuracy of doing translations, for instance, and measuring it, how close it is to human translations, has improved 3.5 times over a period. So that shows that AI is indeed it brings a lot of power, therefore there's a huge amount of adoption, and it's making a lot of difference in our lives. But with this kind of power and with this kind of prevalence, there's a huge amount of responsibility that comes in, because the concept of bias that in fact I'll illustrate is very easy to get to creep into our solutions. And with this widespread use of AI, that can become a major issue. So here is just a simple idea of how bias actually comes in. So this is one of the common examples that I've always used, and many people have used this example. So I'll just use to illustrate. When people were asked to draw image of a shoe, predominantly a large fraction of the people who actually drew those the image of the shoe were looking something like these. It was only a very small fraction of people who drew a shoe like that. And that is an inherent bias that we have in ourselves. And when we train machine learning algorithms, when we make computers learn to recognize shoes, it's very likely that we will end up training our computers, our algorithms, our machine learning solutions to do that very, based on our bias, and that's what becomes the major issue. It's my personal experience also here. There were a couple of teams that were asked to work on facial recognition. The whole idea there was that they will identify the image of a person and be able to say that it is so and so. And the kind of data that different teams collected, by the way, these teams were distributed across the globe. So the teams that were in India, for instance, or elsewhere, versus the teams that were in the US here, each of these teams, the kind of sample data they collected to train the machine learning algorithms was very regional. Typically, they were picking up the familiar celebrities, movie actors, politicians, advertisement models, etc., from their own region. So it's quite obvious that the machine learning algorithm that they would train to identify people would perform better for that kind of facial characteristics as opposed to be more general. So these are the kind of biases that we can introduce into our machine learning solutions or our AI-based solutions. At this time, it is important for me to distinguish and bring in the importance of data, and therefore I'd like to distinguish between the two terms, AI and machine learning. Artificial intelligence is very generally used these days, but it actually means it basically refers to machine learning, and let me distinguish between those two. Artificial intelligence basically stands for any system that demonstrates behavior which would otherwise require human-like intelligence. And this basically can be a very complicated program that is written by a programmer, by a software engineer, and if that program exhibits that kind of intelligence, it would be classified as an artificial intelligence system. However, machine learning is that part of AI field which does not depend on writing the code by a person, but learning that logic from data. And that goes back to the point I was making earlier, software 2.0, that the logic for making decisions in machine learning space is not human generated, but it is generated automatically based on the data that is provided to the algorithms. And let me quickly also mention here as a sidebar that deep learning, the term that we hear so often, is a kind of technique within the realm of machine learning. So it is also based on data. And the point I want to make here is that since when we talk about AI, we are actually talking about machine learning. If the data that we provide to train our machine learning models has bias in it, then the outcome will also be biased. It's garbage in, garbage out. If we provide biased data to train our machine learning algorithms or machine learning models, we will end up coming up with a system that will have the same biases. Now I'll very quickly go over the three kinds of machine learning techniques that are there, and I'll also illustrate to you how bias can creep in each of those. There are three different kinds of machine learning techniques. One is supervised, one category is supervised learning, another category is unsupervised learning, and the third is reinforcement learning. Let me very quickly go over each of those and show you what they stand for and how they can be susceptible to biases. Supervised learning. This is a technique where what we do is we provide examples, training examples to our machine learning algorithms. We basically say, look, if these were the various parameters that were given as the input, the correct output would be such and such. And we give thousands and thousands and thousands of such examples for the algorithms to learn from. And what magic machine learning algorithms do is to start understanding what are the actual correlations between those inputs and the expected output. And that is the learning that the machine learning algorithms do. So they find a very accurate way of mapping those kind of inputs to the outputs as exemplified by the training examples that were given to it. And so here is just an illustration to give you a visual idea of how it works. And this example is, by the way, from Microsoft Azure ML documentation. I find it very illustrative, so I like to use it. Here, what they did was they took a population of people who, and categorized those among that population, those who attended an art festival called Burning Man and who didn't. In this chart, what they did was they plotted all those people based on their age and their income, and marked the ones that attended that festival with those orange circles and that they did not with those blue triangles. It's very clear to see from this that there is indeed a pattern to learn based on this data, which machine learning would actually extract and make its machine learning algorithm perform. The pattern that you see is this. And that's what the machine learning algorithm would catch. It would see that people who are earning a little more than 60,000, who fall between this age range, are much more likely to go to that festival than others. And the machine learning algorithm would then come up with effectively this kind of a logic to determine what is the likelihood of somebody attending that festival. Now here is the point. This was based on a population sample that was used. If we changed that sample population based on whether we took the urban population versus rural versus college-going population, this pattern would shift in one direction or the other, and the actual learned information would be slightly different. That is the bias that we can introduce. Think of mortgage lending. If we were to see what population of people are likely to default in their loans, and therefore we want to assess risk, depending on which population we use to train our machine learning algorithms, the actual trained outcome of that machine learning would be biased based on the kind of data that we provide, the kind of population that we used to train our machine learning model. That is supervised learning and how input data can affect it. Second is unsupervised learning. That's the other category of machine learning algorithms. Here we do not provide it input and output. We just show it the various kind of data, and it seeks out patterns from the data. And basically it identifies what is normal, what is not normal, based on how the data gets organized or how the data gets clustered. Here is an example, just to give you a visual illustration of that. This basically is showing about some parameters that were measured for some aircraft engines, so heat and vibration, and they took a lot of engines and they measured those parameters and then plotted them over here. They all got clustered in this way. So what machine learning would do is it would identify things that fall near this cluster as normal and what fall outside of this cluster as anomalous or abnormal. Again, taking example from mortgage industry, if you were to bin the kind of mortgages that any lender has been approving, you can actually create a biased machine learning model if there was a bias in that lender's historical data itself. So if you are to bin people who are likely to be approved by their underwriters and who are likely not to be approved, and you want to categorize those so that the underwriters can do their job efficiently. So the concept is good, but if there was a bias in the historical data, then the machine learning model would would reflect that bias and perhaps would lead to unfair treatment of the loan applications. The third category and the final and the third category of machine learning algorithms is reinforcement learning. This learns through interaction with external systems or environments, and by and large, majority of those environments are human driven, either directly or indirectly. Basically what it does is it takes some decision, takes some action, and sees how well it performed in the environment, and if the impact was good for the business, then it will treat that as a positive feedback. If it was not good, then it will take that as a negative feedback, and will therefore learn eventually to do things that are good for the business. Using this, a lot of very powerful solutions have been built, but again, it depends on what the environment is. If the response that the system gets, that the algorithm gets from the environment is biased, it will learn that bias. The only very objective ones can be, and this is the only one that I found and I've shown here, are the ones where there's no human input with respect to the response that the machine gets, because it's playing against a computer itself. For instance, this Atari games example, the reinforcement learning system, if it played against a computer, then it would just learn something that the computer does. But in every other case that I could find, there is direct or indirect way in which a human bias can affect the learning of the algorithm. So the point I was making till now is that in all kinds of machine learning examples or the techniques that we have, bias can creep in. And just to summarize the kinds of biases that machine learning can actually get are these three categories. One is latent bias, which is that even when you are trying to ensure that you're not collecting data that has bias, but there is possibility that the data itself inherently has a bias. For example, here's in the second bullet that I'm showing here. This was a very well known example where they collected text from the internet, and there was indeed, without any selection, without any way in which the way the data was collected, without having any bias in that, it just showed that men and women were there was a gender bias in the system, in the data. What the system learned was man is to computer programmer as woman is to homemaker, which was fairly unfortunate. But this is because the data that was collected has inherently higher representation of men being computer programmers and women being homemakers, and that's what the system learned. But it should not have been, but this is latent in the data. The second is selection bias. Selection bias is when the data that is prepared for training machine learning models is influenced by the person who's creating that sample data. And there, it's very easy for people to actually influence the data by their own biases. And the example that I gave earlier was that different regions in the world, when they were asked to, or the teams in different regions in the world, when they were asked to collect data for doing facial recognition, they actually collected data which was local to that region, without any intentional attempt to do that. It just happened that way. So that is selection bias, when the data that you collect is inherently biased because the person who's collecting that data has that bias. And the third category is interaction bias, which I was talking about as the part when I was talking about reinforcement learning, that when system interacts with an environment, and if that environment has that bias, it will learn that bias. The very well-known example of that is Microsoft Tay, which they had to take down in 16 hours after launch because it was learning from the interactions it was having with people. And Microsoft says that they were attacked by some trolls which had a very severe bias in a certain way, and Microsoft tail learned that bias and became totally unacceptable because that bias was fairly offensive. So because it was interacting with people and those people had a very severe bias, the system learned that bias through interaction. And that's the third category of bias that machine learning models can give. And the bottom line that we should be aware of is that while we can attempt to solve all these, but intention itself is not sufficient to solve this problem, because even with very good intentions, it's nearly impossible to separate ourselves from our biases, and that bias will creep into the technology that we develop. So at this point, I would just hand it off to Raymond, but towards the end, I will actually talk about how this can be solved, because the picture is not all that gloomy. The point I wanted to make through this set of slides was that bias is a real problem, and it is not a trivial problem, and its impact can be huge. And towards the end of the talk webinar today, I will tell you how we can effectively counter the bias in our machine learning solutions. Raymond, back to you.
Okay, thank you. So, and actually it's this slide, the machine learning models, how they can be advising is very powerful. I think it's something we have to digest because that's kind of the things we're talking about as well. It's very similar. But what I think is interesting is how, from my perspective, I was expecting fair lending to be that the technology itself that we're given is agnostic insofar as bias, and it's how we use it or how we apply it. Just generally. So in other words, I didn't think the programmers that would come in, and I think it's a very good point to show that we don't even know if that's an issue. So we have to be more vigilant about that. And to be clear, I'm not. To be clear, I'm on this call. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't use technology. On the contrary, I think we should. But I want to make sure the message is read that we should use technology, but we should also be cautious in what we're deploying, or at least understand it enough. I mean, I'm no programmer. I'm not going to know what it is, but you got to ask the right question. So basically what we're hearing is, let the machines do it, right? And we think that's a good idea. It reduces workload and saves time, ensures consistency. If having been in production and those who've done it, there's nothing worse that can happen is actually human inputting into the system. You're going to fat finger something, you can't get the consistency. Typically, you can't get the consistency that you can get with some kind of technology. So you would prefer to have it or not. It takes the discretion out of the process. And I think what's important to understand about fair lending is that one of the key problems with fair lending is a discretion point. Someone in the field, a loan officer, a processor, who has the power to make a decision on something, whether it's pricing or approval or something to that effect. And that discretion, with that discretion comes the ability to make mistakes, or at least in the aggregate. They think they're doing it fine. The person next to them thinks they're doing it fine, but not doing the same thing. So discretion becomes an issue. And so one thing about technology that we do like is that it takes the discretion out of the process. The things that we have seen in the past and letting the machines do it, and I really do mean the past, and then as we progress into it, we've seen automated underwriting before. That has something, we trusted it from Fannie Mae and with DU and with others. It's been pretty well established, but as people are putting on bobbles or different underwriting, automated underwriting systems, we have to be thoughtful about that. We've had compliance engines. Now, compliance engines generally are not making decisions. I mean, they are and they're not. I mean, they're looking at data points and make some assumptions, high cost loan or not. And even then, if you recall, we'll get a lot of false positives simply because they don't possess the data to really make a decision. But they're, for example, bona fide discount points. Is it bona fide or not? The compliance engines will shrug. We don't know. It depends on what you guys define, right? So you don't always have the ability to give you the complete answer. But that's what you get with the compliance engine. And then we've seen it with, of course, marketing, and that's the progress that we're seeing now, particularly with Facebook, which we'll talk about. So what I'm also thinking, though, is that technology it's not just that technology is getting better and smarter and thinking for itself, but the data that we possess, I think, is more granular and, in theory, better. And so we start really working at a different level with the technology, which is both good and bad. We have to know what we have. In fact, we're probably relying on it even more. So I would submit that the information, the machines that we had in the past, let's say the things were introduced in early 2000s, into the 90s, those were great. And we're still kind of relying on them. But as we're going forward, I think there's smarter machines out there and smarter data that are even going to do a better job of figuring things out. And I say better in quotes because we have to be cautious, as you can tell, it's my theme. But so we have to be really aware of that. And I know that there's people out there who are trying to do that. And I think Atul and Tavant doing the same thing. People are coming up with better ideas, and we should, if we said, takes discretion out and shows consistency. We want the machines to do it. That seems to be the trend. Something to think about, though, is if we do have machines doing it, it invites a new discretion, right? So there's going to be discretion points somehow. And Atul did a great job talking about how bias creeps into the system. And so while we think that we're doing okay, maybe it's a false sense of security, there's actually some bias either built in by virtue of either program or by the data itself or how it's used. So it has some form of discretion. And one thing that actually happened is you get a trend issue. So as we said, there's consistency. We have to be careful with consistency as well, because once you have a system that's getting it wrong once, it's going to get it wrong all the time. So that's one thing to think about. You have unintended consequences, logical and smart analysis. We talked about that. That you have in a sense of you got great data, you have good information. The question is, once you, and it makes sense, as and as Atul rightly said in his examples, it really comes up with the right answers. The question is it actually technically right? Should we be thinking about those? Should we think of that information? So additionally, the power of big data, and that's where we start talking about what we've seen more, certainly in marketing we saw recently. The power of big data is so alluring that it'll attract people in production to use it and rely on it in a big way. What does that mean? That's a euphemism for those who are particularly in compliance, probably in quality control as well, where you hear everybody else is doing it, why can't we? And it must be right because it's on the market, so there's no problem with it. I know everyone's kind of shaking their head right now. We've all had that. There's going to be a greater pressure for us to allow the technology to come into play, and maybe faster and harder than before. And so we have to be prepared for that there's even going to be a bigger push from sales or marketing. And I'm not knocking it. By the way, they're the best allies you can have. As I say, like with marketing and sales, if the phone doesn't ring, I don't have a job. So I respect what they do, and they get very creative, and they're relying on us to make the right decision. So of course they're going to say something that, from their perspective, sounds good. It's our job to kind of trick it back or filter it correctly. And I think that's what's going to happen. We're going to see more of that. Basic technology, any technology, is fair lending agnostic. We have to be concerned about that. And again, Atul had talked about that greatly, about how it doesn't really integrate some of the things, or maybe it's drawing conclusions that, as he says, it shouldn't. I mean, if you think about it, technically, if that's what the data set says, that a man is a programmer and a woman is a homemaker, that's the data set. The question is, we shouldn't act upon it, or should we? So, and I just don't think we should. That becomes the issue. So, and ultimately, technology we use needs to be fair lending sensitive. How do you get sensitivity in there? Do you program it, or is it something that we just have to understand? This goes back to, we have to understand the programming and what's going on in the process. Again, I don't want to be a programmer, but we have to ask the right questions. So letting the machines do it, I think, is a good idea, but these are the things we have to be careful of. And again, Atul gave great examples. By the way, he had better slides than me. He's got the graphs. I'm going to have to start doing graphs. But it really kind of explains how the data is being used, and for good, not just evil. Now, okay, so what I want to bring up next is dealing with data is not a new problem, okay? Dealing with technology is not a new problem. So let's talk about that. Big data. So I'm going to talk from a marketing perspective. And it goes to others, underwriting and pricing as well, but in other areas. But I like to think about marketing because that's really where we're seeing a lot of it right now. 20 years ago, I recall, about 20 years ago, I had a client in a private practice at the time that came to me and said, hey, we want to use this information so that we can target our marketing better. Can we use it? And I said, well, let me see. Well, let's see, because we can highlight, we can actually exclude females, and we can exclude this. In fact, wait a minute, these are all protected classes. Well, yes, but it's out there, so it should be okay to use. Like, no, it's not necessarily okay to use. Now, where they got the information from, maybe they were survey cards, I'm not really sure, but the information was powerful. But it's wrong if you're going to use it in the wrong ways, at least it violates the Fair Housing Act or just notions of fair lending. So it's been out there before. So yes, can we use it? The answer is, let's go with no. So this is not the first time that we've seen some of the things crop up that data can be really used, and we can get a higher return rate on a direct mail from 1.5% to 4% if I can filter it for this. Like, yeah, you probably can, and as a matter of logic, that makes sense. It's just illegal, but it makes sense. So we have to be careful that the data is driving our decisions. The other one, and again, we've seen this in the past, and those who know it, is I'm using FICO. Could be any score, but I'm going to say FICO score, right? We've seen FICO before, and And that was developed in the blah, blah, blah years, 50s, 60s, whatever it was, right, 70s. And in the beginning, it was a black box. We didn't really know what it was filtering, what it was doing. I want to even say, I remember talking to people who worked at FICO, and you would ask them, what's in it? And they said, well, nobody really knows. It was kind of like the recipe of Coca-Cola or KFC, and people really didn't know what went in it. And that creates an issue. Well, then, as we went on, I want to say things like, what was it, 2004, we had FACTA, we had these things. There was suddenly an obligation that we had to start, well, I should say the credit reporting agencies had an obligation to start reporting why somebody was declined, for example. So you had some filters. We kind of had a better grasp of it. So what ended up happening in the sense of credit score machines, I submit, is that the box became kind of translucent gray box. We could see a little bit into it. It's not as dark, but it was something else. So again, technology that we're not sure, powerful technology upon which we are making decisions, it's existed before, and we had to coexist with it for many years. It's not the first time. It's just getting better. It's coming to us faster, and I think the issues can be greater. It's just extrapolated the issue. Oh shoot! I have to go back. Okay, sorry. Can I go back? Susan, can you give me a back?
Yeah. You can just go back.
Yeah, you make it sound like
just
I can do that.
the up arrow or back arrow.
I don't have.
Let me do it for you.
Yep.
Okay.
It's technology. I didn't say it was good at that. Fair lending, I know. So
is that where you want to be?
I don't know. Yeah. I wanted to, not yet. I want the fair lending piece, so it's one back. It should say Facebook. There we go. That one. Thank you. Thank you. I apologize for that. Okay, so now I want to talk about Facebook. And why do I want to talk about Facebook? Because it's probably the most recent issue that we've had, something about technology. And even if you ask me, I really couldn't say. I don't know that Facebook's technology is anywhere as advanced as a tool's technology that he was talking about. But Facebook recently was impacted by fair lending issues when it was actually originally the National Fair Housing Alliance that came after them, and then eventually also HUD, and on the basis of fair lending. And the issue that Facebook had was that they were, and think about it, it's powerful. They have the social media. They can track all kinds of information about where you go, what you do, what your interests are. And so they have all this data they possess and can share with people to say, if you want to market, we can actually help you target better. Okay, so it was really, I said, very rich, highly user-centric concentration of consumer information, and it's powerful. And again, when you're talking about people who have to make the phones ring, so if you're talking about marketing, that's a very powerful thing for them to use. Problem was they were able to, Facebook allowed us to, and lenders to use, to pick and choose what factors they wanted. And it was very comfortable for people, if you're in marketing, I'm not blaming them, this happens, that they would pick things that you and I would look at and say, you can't do that. So you can't pick based on, on the religion or the race. I mean, as much as it sounds like I have an effective result, you can't do that, and you shouldn't do that. So really what I thought would happen with Facebook, and for those in risk management, quality control here, probably already knew this. When you saw Facebook, you probably weren't overly surprised that it was an issue. I think some people were, but I think in our world, we didn't think, of course you can't do that. We said for 20 years you can't do that, or as long as we've been doing it, you can't do that. You can't pick and choose your targeting based on these factors. You just can't, and you shouldn't. So that was a bit surprised that some people didn't know that. What also was interesting, and maybe some relevance here, and including for Atul and others who are offering these tools, is that the Facebook stands for the proposition that a non-lender can be held accountable for the fair lending problem. I thought that was interesting. It was not the lenders that were hit, or maybe they were, and we just don't know those actions are going on. But Facebook was putting it into the stream of commerce. And if you look actually at the Fair Housing Act, that actually is a problem. That's a case law that says, yes, you can be held liable for that. And that's how Facebook got connected to it, even though they're not a lender. They just put it out there. They're Napster, they're Uber, they don't know, whatever. It's like, it's not my responsibility. They said, yes, it is. Under the Fair Housing Act, yes, it is. Also, and again, not that we have all the data and all the information within the legal actions, because a lot of it's confidential. But what I gather happened here as well, and this might be important when you're establishing marketing policies, and I've heard the arguments from the marketing departments as well as to how they want to use data. And the totality of your balanced marketing plan is irrelevant. In other words, the fact that you can choose that I'm going to use this factor, and we know it's a protected class, is the challenge. the fact that you may have chose, so for example, I chose a non-minority and that's what I'm doing, but I also chose for my advertising a minority group and this is what I'm doing. In other words, in balance, my approach is that I'm not having any fairly, I'm not discriminating, I'm just doing it differently, right? And what I gathered from Facebook was, no, just the fact that you can choose. They didn't look at the whole marketing plan. It was the fact that you could choose. Again, not sure that's exactly what it stands for, but that's what I think it might stand for. So it's not simply that I can imbalance my marketing is fine. It's the fact that you have the power to choose on factors that you shouldn't be choosing about. I think that was one of the concerns. And ultimately, it stands for data aggregated by machines, technology. It can be problematic, right? And I said it before, it's very alluring. It's really kind of comfortable to be able to rely on the information. And marketing will want to use it as much as possible. So something you have to defend against. All right, so let me move quickly here. There we go. Oh, by the way, one thing I want to think about too is when we're talking about technology, we're talking about the data, we're talking about things, are they biased, are they an issue? We want to think about the things, the data that's out there that might be good to use and we are not. So the absence of data into some kind of artificial intelligence, machine learning, might be something to think about. So for example, if you're using, would it be good maybe to use some kind of alternative credit score or credit information for borrowers because it might actually benefit them even though we're not conventionally considering to use that information. So you have to think about that. As I say, is that subprime thinking? Kind of. It doesn't make it wrong. It just means we have to be thoughtful about it. For all we know, it could be a positive impact and a positive impact on how we treat minorities as well. It might be a good indicator of what their creditworthiness is. So we shouldn't eliminate or avoid using data that might be powerful. I think it's part of our analysis as well. Okay, so what did we have before? Same thing with underwriting. Oops, where to go? So what you want to think about is when you're analyzing information and the data that's coming in and the factors they're using is to find out, obviously knock out the obvious thing. The things that could be race, ethnicity, whatever it is, obviously we shouldn't be using those elements. I think the trickiest part is when you're going to have something that is going to be, that makes you stop and go, I don't know what that's going to do. I don't know what the impact is going to be. And an example here, if you're using like an underwriting engine, is the data somehow extrapolating and using it and putting it into its intelligence that it's adjusting projected income based on where it contains periods of maternity leave. I'm just making an example. I have no idea if that exists. But what if it does? Well, that could have an adverse impact on females, right? Of course. And should they really be considered? The answer is no. But it might be something subtle we're not thinking about that it's taking into the decisioning factor. And that's where we have to be very, very cautious. So what do we do for compliance? You know what? I would look at the HMDA data, right? As we talked about, not everything we can cover. I don't know what the program or the type of shoe he was looking at, how he defined it. But we can do is we go back and see what our data looked like to begin with, or the results that we have based on our aggregated data. That we do control, that we do have our HMDA data. So you might want to check to see exactly, looking at your applications, if you're doing marketing, it's more of the invitation to apply. Compare the minorities versus non-minorities. Compare it to your competitors. Compare it to your past periods. Is it changing? Is it balanced? Is it still good? That's what that's something you're going to have to make sure is, like I said, somewhat balanced and there's no change. That's the best. It doesn't really solve for everything. It may not solve for the problem that the marketing thought was incorrect, or the data the technology was incorrect in what they was doing. But at least you can say, at least I checked as well. I'm doing what I can to control for this. Same thing with underwriting. You want to look at your denials versus your approvals, minorities versus non-minorities, competitors, past periods that you want to look at. By the way, when you're doing, in my opinion, when you're looking at HMDA data and doing kind of a fair lending light analysis with your HMDA data, don't just look at the national level. You have to look at some of the MSAs. You look at other cuts of the data to really find out what's going on. It's one thing to say that I do well in Michigan, but if I cut it towards between what the city of Detroit's doing and the city of Auburn, do I have impact? I might. But don't get comfortable with the fact that in the state of Michigan, I look good. You have to break it down even further. So anytime you do this analysis, challenge yourself. Don't just rely on, hey, we look good nationally. That's not necessarily the answer. Okay. Oops. And now, okay, Atul, I think we're back to you. Atul, are you there? Are you still on mute?
You know what? He is self-muted, and I can send him a note. I can't unmute him.
Yeah, thank you. So,
Yeah, you are.
so yeah, Susan, you didn't want me to speak, it seems. I'm just kidding. All right, so this is the final slide of our presentation today, and as Raymond talked a lot about, and very important information that he talked about was, how we should go about fighting that kind of a bias, or how do we combat reducing that kind of unfairness in the solutions. So here's a summary of from a technology guy's perspective of how we can combat bias. So first, I'll just mention about the technical kind of solutions. So first thing is, and all of these apply. We cannot do just one or the other, but using all of these techniques, we can reduce the impact of bias, or we can reduce the amount of bias that our solutions might end up with. So first is just try to get data which is less biased, and for that, just like we have code reviews when you do software development, just like we have design reviews when we're doing architecture, we should do data reviews. So when multiple set of eyes are looking at the data and checking it out, the chances of catching that bias improve, and therefore there's some level of reduction in bias right there. Second is, there are a lot of tools that have been developed and that are available through which we can actually analyze the data for biases. There are about more than 180 specific kinds of biases that have been identified, and those tools actually address, or rather check, the data for all those different kind of biases in the data, and they help you identify if there is any bias that the data actually has. So it helps you zero out that kind of data bias in the data itself. Next step would be that now you use that data to build models. So there are, again, techniques, and one of the examples is a paper that I've mentioned below, and there are lots of such kind of research that's going on, through which we can actually zero out specific biases that we observe in the models that we have created. For instance, the example, this paper is, the example that I gave earlier, that was man is to computer programmer as woman is to homemaker. That kind of bias, by basically neutralizing the terms computer programmer and homemaker from gender perspective, so that there is no association of these terms to either of the gender. So those kind of, and it can be done in a very automated fashion once you know that there are gender bias being shown by certain algorithms that have been used, or rather the certain models that have been created by those algorithms. So there are lots of ways to do that too. And while we have a lot of solutions existing, there's a lot of research going on to make those systems also more and more efficient and more effective. So that is still work that's going on. But today there are a number of techniques that can be used to do that. And then other than that, we have few other ways of combating bias, and that is basically to have transparency and let our solutions be audited by the so that any bias that has crept in can actually be caught, and there's an opportunity to fix that. And also it has been observed that if we have a diverse workforce, that also helps to mitigate, because there a bias of one kind of a group may be flagged or may be actually noticed by other groups, and therefore overall such kind of biases can be caught and fixed. I will leave you with one last thought, and that is a quote from Andrew Ng, that today we have better ideas today about reducing bias in AI than about reducing bias in humans. So AI is not bad after all. So that's a positive thought that I wanted to leave you with, that we can solve the problem of bias creeping into our technology, and there are many ways of doing that.
There's nothing to cancel.
Okay.
That concludes my.
Well, thank you both, Atul and Raymond. Thank you so much for your presentation today. We really appreciate that. Oh, I'm hearing some background noise. If you're on and not speaking, maybe if you could mute. We will be making this slide webinar has been recorded, and it will be available on our website probably early next week. And you can share that webinar with your colleagues, or if there was somebody in your office that wasn't able to join us today. So now I invite you to pose any questions that you might have to our presenters. You can. We need to have you mute your lines if you're not speaking, because I can hear a reverb. I can read some of the questions here that have been posed. There's one for Atul. Could Atul give one name of a tool that exists to weed out unwanted biases for race/ethnicity? Atul, do you have that?
Yeah, sure. So I will not name the one, any tool, but I can tell you that there are tools coming from various, usual suspects like Google, like Facebook, like IBM. There are a lot of tools, and there are a lot of tools in the open source domain also that exist that do weed out different categories of biases from the data as well as and they can also do some kind of an audit on the models themselves.
Okay, great, thank you. We are a little over our time, so I wanted to again thank our presenters, Atul, Raymond, for a great webinar today. We really appreciate it. Letting you all know that our next month's webinar will be on June 27th. We'll be talking about one of our favorite topics, loan officer compensation and broker compensation. Our speakers will be Rich Andriano, a partner at Ballard Spahr, and Mike Barone, general counsel at MQMR. So mark your calendars for June 27th, and you can join us then. That's it for today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and hopefully we'll see you next month.